Is that working?
Mm-hmm.
All right. So we got an error from the broadcasting software saying that the broadcast was canceled. So I'm just gonna check and see if that's coming up for you all. All right. This live streaming is fraught with technical problems. Let's see what happens here. Sorry, everybody. I'm just trying to confirm that this is actually streaming properly. We got an error from the broadcasting for saying that. All right, it looks like it's going. Okay, so I'm going to leave that up just with the volume off, and then we can make sure it's all working fine. So I say this is a recipe that we're going to do. That's something that's on Clover's menu. It's really yummy. I'll talk a little bit about where the idea for it came from. And then I thought, I was thinking about making grilled cheese because I love grilled cheese and tomato soup. Sometimes at our house we do open face sandwiches, and I'm not sure if that's something everybody does. It's really easy to do, it's a lot of fun, it's fun to make with kids. So we're going to do open face sandwiches, sort of an alternate to grilled cheese. Both of these things are really simple to make, they're really fast and easy to make, and super delicious. And hopefully these are working with things that you have in your home pantry. So let's get started with what we have here. I might say a few words before we jump into the cooking. There have been some questions about Clover employees and how things are working out. Really kind questions. Somebody wrote in and asked if there was a tip fund or something like that they could contribute to. It's a really great idea. We hadn't started anything like that, but if people have interest, it might be good to do something like that. I know that GoFundMe is a platform people are using for stuff like that. So that's something we'll look into. I like the idea a lot. There's right now everybody's furloughed, everybody in the company, and so we're just eager to get back and started, but we obviously aren't going to do that until the crisis subsides. And in the meantime, we're doing things like this cooking shows. I also want to acknowledge Lucia and Jane have been a big help, and they, like me, are furloughed from Clover, but they have an interest in what we're doing here and have been helping behind the scenes. So thank you to them for helping make this all work and helping a lot of you find the show. Let's get started now with these recipes. So first, let's do the soup, and you're going to need some olive oil. And if you don't have olive oil, you can use any other oil, canola oil. You can even use butter if that's what you have. We're going to use a can of tomatoes, and I love these tomatoes. They're called Muir Glen, so maybe that's part of it. We like these tomatoes, but they're really yummy. When I was a kid, this company existed, and I remember not liking their ketchup at all, and I didn't like their canned tomatoes at all, but I think that right now, these tomatoes are some of the best tasting canned tomatoes. They're really yummy. So these ones are whole peeled tomatoes. When you go into the grocery and you're buying tomatoes, there's this wide range of choices. You can get crushed tomatoes, you can get diced tomatoes, you can get pureed tomatoes, you can get whole tomatoes, and I think it can feel confusing. Any of those are fine. If you have the whole tomatoes, you can always crush them or dice them or puree them, so it's not a bad place to start, but you can really grab anything that's there. I would advise against the ones that have basil added in. So I just don't see why you'd ever want the basil in there. I think it just gets in the way of what you'd want to do with what's in the can. Also, some of the tomatoes, part of what makes these ones really delicious is they pack these in the tomatoes juices, which is great. And so they don't have, if you look on the back here, it's, why it's rejecting it, okay. All right, so we had another interruption. Sorry about that, guys. I'm not sure what's happening with YouTube Live, but it keeps kicking it. And we just started it up again, so I'm just gonna wait and make sure it's working fine. What I wanted to tell you all was that, all right, looks like we're back on. This tomato soup is almost as fast to make as opening Campbell's tomato soup, and it tastes a lot better. And so I would encourage you all to try making it if you've never made tomato soup before, and if it seems like a funny thing to try and make, try this out. It's really easy. Good. Ingredients are really limited. It's so yummy. And the tomato soup we're making, we call it Roman tomato soup. When we had a family trip to Rome, and Martina, who worked for me, I was hoping I'd get her on this episode, but her brother's birthday today, so she's doing more important things. But she's an employee of ours who started as an intern and then worked for us for a while and ran food development for Clover and did a wonderful job. She's now back in Italy, and when I was going to visit Rome with my family, I asked her for recommendations, and she told us a bunch of really fun things to do. A lot of them were food related. One of the things she told us to do is go to this restaurant, and she recommended we order a dish which I had never had before, and it was like mashed potatoes with mashed carrots in it and sort of some old tomato sauce, like more pasty tomato sauce mixed in. So it was like sort of like an orangish colored mashed potatoes. It was really, really yummy. It was like it was simple but different than things I'd had before, and I can sort of understand where it would come from, but I hadn't been exposed to that before. When I came home, I was thinking you could make tomato soup with some of the same ideas. And the fun thing about this tomato soup is you are working with these canned tomatoes, which we really can't source locally right now unless you're using some tomatoes you canned yourself. But carrots we can source, and these carrots are carrots grown in Massachusetts. So we get to add these into the soup, and they're really yummy. The other thing we get to add in is a potato, and that's another thing that, this time of year even we have potatoes that are locally grown. So a fun way to bring some other vegetables into the tomato soup, and we're going to have onions as well. These onions, I believe, are a commercial onion. It's not a locally grown onion, but depending on the time of year, you might be able to get something from a local farmer. So you can take something like tomato soup, and some of the dollars you're spending on it can go back to support agriculture in the area. All right, should we get started?
Yeah.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Let's turn the oven on because we're going to make open-faced sandwiches later. So we're going to turn that oven on to 375 and just preheat it. And then we'll get some heat going on this pot here. All right, so let's get some onions chopped up. Do you want to chop the onions? Or do you want me to chop them up? You can work on the carrots maybe.
Yeah,
You want to do that?
I'll do the carrots.
All right. So we're just going to work with a medium-sized onion here. And if you have garlic, you could add garlic into this, also really delicious. If you didn't have an onion but you had leeks, that would be really yummy. I've used chives and things like that. So there's a lot of oniony things that you can use either in substitution here or in addition. Okay, and so I'm facing the root side away. This is like the fourth time I've done this now. We've only been doing the cooking show for 2 weeks, but we use a lot of onions. And this is true for a lot of things you cook at home. A lot of things build flavor off of onions, which I think is great. I love onions. Now, I cut these more finely than I needed to. This can be a pretty rough chop, so you can do like a big rough chop. Definitely don't take a lot of time doing that because we're going to puree all of this in a little bit. So I'm going to add some oil into this pot. It's probably 4 tablespoons of oil. I'm going to be a little bit generous because this is really the only fat. Alright, so we'll get those going there. And then, do you want to chop those? Do you want to use my knife or do you want to use your own? You use that. Be careful. You got it? Good job. And these can be pretty coarse chop as well. Because they're just going to go in here. Good job, Clem. So that hit the ground. I washed it off. The carrot's going to be fine. Clementine was having the carrots roll, which is like a big problem when you're cutting carrots. I can show you a little bit of a trick. If you keep the tip of the knife on the table, you have a little more control of the blade, so you can have like a little more controlled cut at the bottom instead of that snap where the carrot goes flying. The other trick out to it is there's just a slight twist to the blade as you get toward the bottom, which separates the carrot in like a controlled way instead of it snapping. So whereas if I'm going like this, it's going to hit, and sometimes they go flying. If I have a more controlled cut, I might, in a little twist at the bottom, I can keep that carrot there. That's like a subtle skill that you can develop over time. All right, so these onions, I want them to go translucent. They're just about there. This is pretty quick. This is a nice high temperature. This whole soup is going to be very, very quick. The whole idea is you've got hungry kids, it's lunchtime, and you want to make something in like 15 minutes or less. So these are getting translucent. That looks great. The onions are going to provide some layers of flavor and some sweetness in the soup. It's going to be really yummy. We're going to go ahead and just throw these carrots in with those. The heat and the oil will soften them a little bit. Is that good?
Yeah.
All right. And we have some dogs fighting in the background, I think, while play fighting. All right. So these potatoes I'm cutting pretty coarsely, not that different than the carrots. You're going to go ahead and add those to the pot. And let's get a can opener and open those tomatoes. And you having trouble with it? Here. It's always a little tricky. This can opener is a little hard. This kind of can opener does a cool thing, which is it doesn't leave any sharp edge on the can, but it is a little bit tricky to use it. All right. Okay, so we have whole tomatoes in here, packed in that tomato juice. And what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and we're just going to add that on. Now there's some tomato left in here, and I don't want to miss any of that yummy tomato. So I'm going to come over here to the sink, and I'm just going to rinse the tomato juice into that can. No need to waste it. And then I'm going to use that to add water to the soup. So this soup is a stock-free soup. You can just I mean, if you have some soup stock, some veg stock or something, you could definitely use that. We're making it without, and probably at Clover we use veg stock because we have a really beautiful veg stock we use for everything. But at home I rarely would use veg stock. And right now I don't have any vegetable stock because my refrigerator's full. We set ourselves up to be at home for a while. So the refrigerator is packed, and I don't dare make stock because I don't have any place to store it. Normally I would have it, and it would add a little layer of flavor, but it's going to be delicious without that. So what we're going to do is let this come up to a hard boil, and we're going to let it rip away at a hard boil for about 10 minutes. It's just, we need to 5 or 10 minutes. We need to soften the potatoes and the carrots. Once those are soft, then we're going to puree the soup, and we're going to be on our way to finished. So that is the Roman tomato soup. We'll come back and visit this in a little while and finish it off. And in the meantime, should we make some open-faced sandwiches?
Yes,
All right.
let's do that.
You guys want to make some open-faced sandwiches? So, Blue, you want to help us put these together?
Sure.
All right, awesome. We need some ingredients from the refrigerator. You want to try and grab some pesto and some mustard, some cheese and some kale, and there's some mushrooms in that brown bag. Some kraut might even be good. So, actually, that awesome sauce could be fun too. You could grab that too. So, this is something we do pretty often as an alternative to making grilled cheese, is open-faced sandwiches. It's something my dad used to make a lot. And when I was a little kid, I had this friend named Sorrel, and one of the things he was allowed to do at his house, and I remember, I was probably about Blue's age, is he was allowed to make pizza toast. So we would make pizza toast, which is sort of like what it sounds like, a slice of bread with some tomato sauce on it and some cheese on it. And I loved doing that. It was really yummy. That's something I did at home when I was a kid too. Sometimes my dad would make open-faced sandwiches to use up some crusty bread we had or something like that. It's something I like pretty well. I love onions on this, and I like those onions to be pretty thick. So you can see I cut those pretty thick, and we're going to put these like half rings on there. Basically, to build these pizza toasts, we're going to use sliced bread, and then we're going to put spread of some sort. So mustard can work really well for that. Pesto works really well for that. You can use a number of different things. And then we're going to have some cheese. So we're going to use some cheddar cheese. And then we're going to put some toppings on. So kale's a really yummy topping. We've got some mushrooms. We have some onions. Those will all work really well. Let's use this bread. Tulip is having a fun time. You can bring her over here. Tulip! What's going on? Want to be on the show today? Well, now she thinks I'm talking to her about the bread, which is Tulip's favorite thing in the world. When Tulip was a little puppy, her mom, we found out from the home she grew up in, her mom used to go and steal bags of bread from the pantry in the kitchen and bring them back to feed the puppies. And Tulip had a strong affinity for bread, I think, for a long time. So any sliced bread will work fine for this. I think that, this is something you can do with a crusty loaf of bread. You can do it with a loaf like we have right here. This is pretty flexible, and there's a lot of different ways to do this. All right, so what we're going to do, we're going to put these slices of bread on a sheet pan, and you want to get some spoons and some spreading knives. So let's make, whoops, mustard there, Blue. Let's use up the rest of this pesto. Actually, if you have a spatula, that would be really good, Clemmy. Let's use a spatula for the remainder of this pesto. So this is a kale pesto we made the other week. There's not a lot left. And this is really typical for when we make the open-faced sandwiches. It's a great opportunity to use up a little bit of pesto you have left, use up some mustard that you have left. You can put all sorts of spreads. You can put like a spicy spread. Just think of things that taste good with some heat. Thank you. All right. So, Lou, do you want to get some of that pesto on there?
Sure.
All right. Let's do half of them with pesto. Clem, do you want to put mustard on a couple of them?
Sure.
Okay. Awesome. And I'll get some kale ready. If you don't already know this trick, you can take kale and you can remove it from its stem, and you end up having the kale leaves separate from the stem. It's possible to eat the stem, but it's a lot more tough than the greens, and so it can be tricky to try to make sure that both work. So I'm going to put these in a colander right here and rinse them off. I have some mushrooms. My daughter Violet's not the biggest fan of mushrooms. We're trying to teach her to enjoy them, but she's not at that point yet. So we will probably try to make sure there aren't mushrooms on every single one of them.
I love mushrooms.
Yeah, Clem likes mushrooms, so.
I like most mushrooms.
You like most mushrooms? I am dropping a lot of things on the floor today. It's true. It's like roly-poly. Alright. So, nice job there, Blue. So you really want to wash. You want to wash just about every vegetable that comes into your house. If you get to see up close what the supply chain looks like for vegetables, you really want to make sure you wash them. For a lot of these things, the farm is the cleanest place it's been, and between the farm and your house, it's gone through a lot of different hands and a lot of different conditions. So I always wash everything. A colander is indispensable, and we use it a lot. And now with the kale, something I like to do with the kale is it's pretty tough, so you can handle it pretty rough. You see I pulled it into a little bit of wad like that. Now I'm going to come at it with the knife, and I'm going to cut pretty narrow strips of the kale. I'm careful to have my claw so my fingertips aren't sticking out. And the kale does a fun thing in the oven, which is it shrinks a lot. So you guys want to put the kale in a couple of those?
Sure.
Now you can put the kale on top of the cheese, you can put it under the cheese, either way works fine.
I like the cheese on top.
You like cheese on top of it?
Yeah, because it melts over.
Sometimes we make this with grated cheese, I think is what I'll do today. Sometimes we make this with slices of cheese, either one can work. The grated cheese lets the cheese go a little further, so so while we're in isolation, I think it's a good idea for us to grate the cheese just to get a little more distance out of it. I think it's the first thing we've grated on the show. I like box graters a lot. There are other styles of graters that I think are a lot harder to work with, and part of what I like about the box grater is you can tilt it back and get a good angle. And you want to come down on it, and you want to have enough force. See how I'm placing my shoulder above the grater? Graters are funny. I don't think people think of this as like a skilled tool, but it really is. And the more you practice, the easier it is to use and the better results you can get. So you want to get your shoulder above it so you have good control and good weight. As you get to the end of a nub, one thing you can do is just not grate it, which is fine. Another trick that that I learned a long time ago from a chef is that the meat of your hand really doesn't grate. It's like too soft and squishy. So when you get down to it, if you get your knuckles and fingers out of the way, and you come down on the blades with your with the meat of your hand, you won't generally get cut at all. So when you're on those last things, that's the way to go through it. I see you guys like grimacing a little bit, but it really is okay, and it works pretty well. All right, those look awesome. Do we want to put mushrooms on one of them?
Sure.
Connor, do you want to put mushrooms on one of the kale ones?
Yes.
There you go. And then want to put a little bit of cheese on blue. All right, let's just pile up this kale. Now the kale looks like we're going overboard on it, and especially in some of these we have kale and kale. We have kale pesto and kale on top. But it really will shrivel up and shrink a lot once it's in the oven. But you don't have to use kale. You can do this with no kale at all. Roasted red peppers are delicious. Basically, anything that'd be yummy on a pizza is really good this way, or any ingredient you'd like to put in a grilled cheese. You can also just make straight toasties. You can just put cheese on the bread and just do it that way, and that's a fine option as well. But if you like vegetables, this is a good way to get some of them in.
Put pineapples on it?
Yeah, you could put pineapples on it. I haven't done pineapple toasts, but I suppose you could. All right, so we've got some cheese on there. You could put little bits of garlic on there if you wanted. We're not going to do that. One of my favorite things on these is onions. I said that earlier, but there's something really fun that happens. What we'll do is at the end, we're going to broil it. And if you make the onions sort of big like this, they get really sweet.
So good.
I always like an onion in a when they're in onion rings, you know, when they're like fried onion rings, and that onion in the side of the onion ring, if they're like real onion rings and not extruded, but it gets sort of sweet and yummy. I think this does a similar kind of thing. And we could have made these as rings, but I just thought it was a little easier to cut them and handle them this way. So we'll just pile them on. All right, so this doesn't have to be too precise. It's going to be absolutely delicious any way we put it. And I'm gonna hit this with just a little bit of olive oil. You definitely don't have to do this. I probably wouldn't do this if we didn't have the kale on there. But that olive oil is going to change the way the kale cooks a little bit. It's going to bring a little different flavor dimension into the kale in a really yummy way. All right, and Blue's checking out our soup, which is awesome. How's it looking?
Good.
Okay, I'm gonna have you move for a sec so I can get this in the oven. Okay, so we're taking this, and we're putting that in the oven. That's at 375. What I usually do when making the toast is cook them in the oven for a little while. It gets the bread warm, and it doesn't need a lot of time. It's like 5 minutes or so. And then if you're using frozen bread, you can do this also. You just want to cook it a little bit longer. And then once we get to the place where the toast is going to be in good shape, so we want the bread to be like a little bit toasted and yummy. When we get to that spot, then we're going to put it on broil and just finish it on with the broiler. All right, so I think we're in good shape on that. Let's check on our soup here. So what I'm going to look at is I'm going to look at the potatoes. Still, if they're getting softer, but they're not quite as soft as I'd like. So I'm looking at the potatoes, and let me find a carrot in here too. Looking at a carrot, and again, I'm checking the resistance, and it's getting softer, but it's not quite where I want it. So we'll let that go a little bit longer. But we're probably not too far off at this point. The blender we have is really powerful, so we could put raw potatoes in there and it would probably puree them. But if we let them cook a little further, the texture of the final soup will be much more silky and enjoyable. This is also a really nice version of a tomato soup if you like a cream of tomato soup. And if you like a cream of tomato soup but you're vegan, it's a good choice because there's no milk or dairy in there, but the potatoes bring some starch and some creaminess to the soup and some body to give you a little bit of that feeling that you would if you did a cream of tomato soup.
Hey, Papa?
Yeah.
There's a question. Is there anything you can do with kale stems?
Well, that's a great question. I'm about to put them in the compost, so I think that's something you can do with them. Yes, you can do things with. They are edible. At Clover, we don't like to waste the kale stems. So there's some sandwiches we have where we use kale, and in those cases what we would do is with the whole kale, we would just make sure we're cutting them really, really fine so that the kale itself is being cut super fine, and then the stem also is coming out really fine. And especially if you're brining that in some way, it's really not offensive. I wouldn't say it's like you bite into that and it's the best part of it, but it's definitely, if you treat it in the right way, it's not an obviously annoying part of it. If I eat this right now, though, that's not going to be fun. You can use the kale stems to cook with. So if I were sautéing something, I could start out with the kale stems and cook them until they're soft. They're just very fibrous, so they're going to cook differently than the rest of the leaves. So you don't want to try and cook them both at the same time because you'll either go too far for the leaves or you'll go not enough for the stems. But these ones are going to go to the compost, or maybe our chickens will enjoy them, which is just fine. All right. And let me just tidy this up a little bit. Colander away. Are there any other questions coming up there, Blue?
Not so far.
Not so far? All right, well, if anybody else has a question, it looks like Blue is doing a good job monitoring those questions, so you can let us know. I do want to share a couple things with people. Some of you have been sharing with us what you're getting when you try out some of these recipes at home, which is really exciting because what we really want to be doing is encouraging people, inspiring people to try to learn to cook at home. And I'm working deliberately to make sure the recipes we're introducing not only use staples and ingredients that I'm hoping a lot of you either have in your home or you can get your hands on, but we're also using methods and techniques which should be really accessible, and we're using recipes that are very robust. So if you get something a little bit off, it's still going to be a really delicious result. And the idea of all of that is just to encourage everybody to try to cook. I've had a few conversations with people since I've started the show where people will say, "Oh, I'll tell my friend to watch that, or I'll tell my spouse to watch that." And I think that really we should all learn to cook. It seems to me to be like a fundamental life skill, and this is a great opportunity for people, especially those who haven't done it much before, to try playing in the kitchen. I can't think of any better way to spend your time than putting your love into making something you're going to share with other people that you care about. It's a lot of fun. And your kitchen's like your own little chemistry lab, so if you have a engineering or science bent, it can be a really fun place to play around. I'm going to share a couple little pictures. I gotta come over here to hit it. Okay, we'll get to that in just a second. So I'm just gonna share a couple. This is a picture of some brownies that somebody made, and they substituted maple syrup. And they had a super dark chocolate, baking chocolate. It looks really yummy. I'd love to have a taste of that. Here's some quick pickles someone was inspired to make, which I'm super excited to see. We saw a bunch of other examples like this, which are awesome. Somebody made some beautiful popovers. I didn't get like direct permission on all these to share, so I hope it's okay, but I don't have any names on them, so it's pretty anonymous. But those are really beautiful. Those pop much better than the ones we made on the show. This one is from my parents, so I can say that, but that's a Boston baked brown bread, but they made it in a bowl, so it's a little different shape and size than what we made on the show. This is really sweet. This is a tweet that somebody put out. I don't know if the happy birthday was just inspired by having a cake on April 1st or if it was inspired by Brooke's birthday, which was the day before, but really a lot of fun, and thank you so much for sharing that. If you guys have examples of what you've made, feel free to tag us on social media so we can see. If you've got questions about what you're cooking, please send them our way. We'll do our best to answer them or get to those questions. Blue, you've got a question that just came through there?
Yeah,
What does it
how
say?
much water did you put in the soup?
That's a great question. So I'm not. I'm gonna struggle to be really good with recipes, but I'm gonna try really hard and keep asking questions like that. Most of the cooking and baking I do at home, I don't use recipes, but it's taken a lot of years to get comfortable with that, and that's how my grandmother would do a lot of things. It's how my dad cooks a lot of things, but it does take some experience to get that point. So what I can say, I'm not sure exactly how much I added, but it doesn't matter too much as long as you don't drown them. So you can see I have what I would say is enough liquid in there. So it's enough liquid that I see it boiling, it's not burning. If I had too little liquid in here, I would see it starting to burn at the bottom, and there wouldn't be enough liquid flowing around everything. So I have enough to cover and cook it. But the reason I say it doesn't really matter too much is we're gonna blend this, and when we're blending it, we're gonna aim for a final consistency. So if I have a little too much water in here, I might just have to hold some of that back. If I have a little bit too little, I may have to supplement it with some other water. So that's how we'll work with it. So you'll have a better sense of what we're aiming for when we go to the blender.
There's another question.
Another question, yes.
Somebody said they didn't have molasses
Yes.
in their kitchen.
Yes.
So they're wondering if they could use maple syrup instead.
Maple syrup instead of molasses, really good question. Well, I've never tried that. I'm guessing this is for the brown bread or for the baked beans.
Boston baked beans.
Yeah. I mean, I'm sure you could make something really delicious that way. Maybe it'd be like Vermont baked beans at that point. But the molasses brings a very particular flavor in, and it caramelizes in a very specific way. So I think you'd end up with something that's different, but it might be yummy. And if that's what you have, I would say give it a try and see what comes out. Thanks for bringing the questions in, Blue. Good job. All right, you want to just put that mustard away in the fridge, and I'm going to put this guy away here. And I think we're getting close to the point. I'll put the rest of these mushrooms in this bag. I'll pop that in the fridge. Oops, I got a hole in the bag. So I think we're getting close to the point of using the blender. Sorry, I'm going to squeeze in here. I think I can pull this out a little bit. Okay, so I'm just pulling the wire out so I can get that blender out further here. So so you guys can see what I'm up to. Now, I think most blenders say don't put hot liquids in them. We break that rule all the time at work. I think probably every kitchen breaks that rule. I'm going to break that rule right now, but I'm going to give you a little disclaimer, which is be very careful because I don't want anybody hurting themselves. Making yummy food is really important, but it's not worth any personal injury. So I'm taking a look at these. My carrots and my potatoes are starting to get smooth, which is really great. And before I dive into blending them, I'm just going to take a peek at our toast here.
Oh, one more question about the toast.
Yeah.
Someone said they missed the temperature and how long it cooks.
Great. 375 degrees, and so far they've been in there I'd say 5 to 10 minutes. So it'll depend on your bread a little bit. If you have frozen bread, you want to go a little bit longer. I'm looking at if the bread itself is a little toasty. I don't want them to be too damp or wet, and I'm feeling that it is. So it's in pretty good shape. Probably go for another 2 minutes. This is probably going to end up about 8 minutes total, and then we're going to hit the broiler on it at the very end. So we're getting close to that moment. So back to the tomato soup. So what we're going to do now is we're going to bring this over. I've put my blender top, my blender container in the, I guess it's the top, in the sink on purpose. Now they'll do it this way so you can see what I'm doing. And I've done that so if I spill, it's not going to splash all over me or make a mess. And I'm going to carefully, because this is all hot, I'm going to carefully push these ingredients into the blender. I'm going to stop right about there because I don't want to overload my blender. So let me show everybody where we are. We're about halfway full, and this is important when you're working with hot liquids because if you have too much in there, it might explode out. And I have little drips, which is okay. That's part of why I did that in the sink. Now I'm going to make sure the lid is on nice and tightly, and I'm going to grab. This is another little trick for safety. I'm going to grab a towel here. It's a kitchen towel, and I'm going to put that on top of the blender. So that's going to protect me if anything splashes out, which it's not going to, but if it did, I'm protected. The other thing is I'm going to turn my blender all the way to the lowest setting. There's different styles of blenders, but whatever you have at home, there's usually some variability in the speed. You're going to want to bring it to the lowest setting, and you're going to start it at the lowest setting. I'm going to let that go for a few seconds, and that's going to chop everything into smaller pieces. And now I'm going to turn the speed up. I'm at the highest speed right now. I'm going to let this go for a little bit. I'm going to turn my speed down before I turn it off, and the reason I do that is so I don't forget and leave it at the high speed and hit it by accident next time. And boom. So I always turn it down to the lowest speed before I turn it off. And now we have a puree. And this is probably a little bit thinner, less thick than the puree we had in Italy, but this is actually very, very similar. It's potatoes, carrots, tomatoes, and it's onions too. And now, since I still have so much soup in this pot, I'm probably going to transfer this into a separate vessel. I'm going to use this right here. This is a soup tureen. You may not have this at home, that's fine. A bowl will work just fine. But I'm going to go ahead and pour this into that. And now we're going to do a second batch. And this is an important technique when you're pureeing hot soup. You don't want to try and do it all at once. You don't want to overload your blender. You want to take your time and do appropriate sizes. It will also help it blend a little better. Now this one I just did, that first one's thicker than I want it to be in the end. This one I just did is even thicker yet. It doesn't have as much water, so I'm actually going to add some water to that. And I still have one more go at it, so I'm hopefully, even if I overshot it a little, made it too watery, the next one I can make it thicker. So same thing again. We're going to start up slowly. We're going to let those pieces get cut up into smaller pieces. We're going to bring this up. Now, this is a pretty serious blender. It's a Vitamix blender.
Oh, there's a question. Is this glass or plastic? And this is plastic.
Plastic. It's plastic. And this is a very serious blender. You may not have a blender like this at home. I didn't have a blender like this at home until I got into the profession of cooking. If you have I'll make this soup at my parents' house. Well, I gave them a blender like this, and Brooke's parents' house, but now I give them a blender like this. I do really like these powerful blenders. They're a pretty big investment, but they allow you to do so many things you can't without. That said, if you don't have this at home, no worries. If you have a more traditional blender that doesn't have this like 2 horsepower engine in it or whatever this has, all you have to do is just go on a high speed and go a little longer than what you see me doing here. Maybe go and blend this for like 2 minutes if you see me doing it for about a minute. So I'm gonna turn that up. Down and off, and I'm gonna go ahead and pour that in, and it's still pretty thick. So now I'm gonna at the end I'm gonna definitely add some more water to it. So let's get the last batch here. Now I want some of this stuff to get in there too, so I'm just gonna add some water into that pot. Wash those last onions in there, and we're gonna go ahead. Put the lid on. Wait, one more. Same process. Slow speed. Turn it on. Give it a second. Put my little safety cloth on there. Let the pieces get small. I'm sort of listening to it in my ears. At first it sounds like, and now it's sounding like boop, 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 boop. It's like a more even sound. That's because all those pieces are getting more similar size. All right, I'm going to turn up speed now. Done. And so we're doing great here because we're like 45 minutes into the show. I've done a lot of talking. We've made the soup. We've made the sandwiches. The sandwiches are just about to be finished. The soup is about to be finished. So if you were doing this in real time at home, you could probably take about, maybe the first time you do it takes you 35 minutes, and then the second time you do it might take you 20 minutes. We're going to take this soup now and pour it back into the pot. So I was using that as an intermediate container, but it happens to be the container I'm going to use to serve the soup later, so I don't want to, back to my rule of trying to mess up as few pots as possible. I'm going to use my blender base, blender top, to get some more water. All right, now we're going to talk a little bit about the thickness of the soup, and we're going to finish the soup. So if you see this, it's a pretty thick soup. I don't like my soup this thick. If you liked your soup this thick, stop here. There's nothing wrong with it. This is a matter of personal taste, but I'm going to add some more water into the soup. So we'll add some water in there. What I'm going to do is mix it and take a look at the texture. It's still a little bit thicker than I want it, so I'm going to add some more water. And if you were using soup stock, you could use soup stock for these steps. It's still a little bit thick to me. I'd like it a little more thin than that. We can get a little more water. Okay, so I'm going to add some more in. And the more you do this kind of thing, the more comfortable you get with, with this volume of soup, with that texture. How much water do I add to get it to where I want? If you're not at that point of comfort, just go slowly until you get what you want. Just a little more, and that's also just water. It's just handy for me. Okay, now do you see that texture? So I would say that's similar to that popover batter. It's a little bit like heavy cream. And I like that texture. That's a good place for us to be. So we're happy with that. Now, we're going to add some salt to this. And Lou, you want to grab a bunch of spoons that we can use for tasting?
Sure. There's one more question about the blender.
Yes.
Someone asked if immersion blender would work.
Technically, yes. I wouldn't recommend it. Unless you have like a serious commercial immersion blender, it's really hard to get a nice puree. But if it's the only blender you have, go ahead and use the immersion blender. If you're using immersion blender, I used to have one, I don't right now. I would recommend using it in a container that has like a smaller diameter. So I'll give you an example of that.
I need some spoons. Let me come up.
All right. So if you're using immersion blender, like this is what I would blend it in. And what you'd want is you want some sides that aren't too far away from the immersion blender itself. And you can focus mostly on going up and down instead of having to go around and around. If you're going around and around, you're going to be chasing stuff around, and it's going to be hard to get it all blended. If you have something a little more vertical, it's better chance of getting everything blended. I'd go a little longer if you're doing the immersion blender, or you have a little chunkier soup, which is fine too. It'll just be like a more rustic soup. All right, so let's do oregano, like about a teaspoon of oregano. So that's a pinch. Come over here. So you don't want to, here, let's do it like this. I'll show you. So I'll teach you guys, while I'm teaching Clementine, how to not use the measurement when you do this. But I'm going to put about that much in, okay? So this is that, let me see how close I am to a teaspoon. Probably good to calibrate this for the recipe.
Smells good.
It smells good?
Yeah, the toast smells good.
All right. So here we go. All right, let's see.
I have the spoons.
Yeah, I'd say it's a scant teaspoon, but that's about what we have there. And then we're gonna add some salt. So we're gonna start with some salt. This is gonna be similar. If you watched the soup recipe yesterday, we tasted as we went. So I'm gonna start out with some salt in that soup. Tomatoes love salt, just like beans love salt. The flavor really, really develops as you add some salt. And so I'm gonna start out with that salt. And Blue got me some tasting spoons, which is awesome. Thank you, buddy. And we're gonna start with one. This is gonna be very hot. Want to taste it?
Sure.
All right, so you can taste 2 clumps if you want. And I'm gonna put a little bit of pepper. So we're using salt, pepper, and a little oregano in the soup here at the end. So that tastes to me like there's not enough salt in there. What do you think, Blue?
Yeah, I think there needs to be a little more salt.
So we don't want to taste the salt. We're not trying to taste for the salt. We're trying to taste for the flavors. And we want to stop with the salt before we can taste the salt. So we just want to taste the flavor of this in the soup. But we don't want it to taste salty. So let's taste it now and see if that gets closer. So that's awesome. So compared to the first taste I had, it's like coming alive in my mouth. I can taste it in a lot more different spots in my mouth. And it's got a lot more depth of flavor. I like that a lot. I'm going to add just a teeny bit more. Maybe in whole that was like 3 teaspoons of salt or something like that. But again, that's going to vary a lot based on if you're using soup stock or not. If the tomatoes you used were salted beforehand or not. There's different factors that can come into play.
Oh, with the toasts.
Yeah.
Somebody asked, they don't have a saucepan, so they're wondering if a Dutch oven, I think, would work.
Oh, they don't have a sheet pan
Yeah.
for the toast. Could you use something else? Yeah, anything that holds them in there. You could just put them on the rack too. Problem with putting on the racks, they might drip. So if you have something to catch the drips, that would work. You could put them on aluminum foil. That would work fine too. All right.
Oh, it's for the veggies actually.
For the
veggies.
for the soup.
Maybe
think?
from a past video.
Oh, okay. If you want to ask that question again, we'll clarify it for us and then we'll answer it. All right. So I've turned the oven on broil now, and we're going to take a look at these toasts. What we hope happens is that the cheese gets a little bit brown and bubbly, which is starting to happen, and these onions are going to get not burnt, but they're going to get a little bit of this dark browning going on. And you can see the kale's getting to that dark brown too. So we're not aiming for anything to be burnt, but we're aiming for it to be like just shy of being burnt. It's definitely going to be on like the sort of toastier side. Not the whole thing, but little bits of it. And those are going to bring really fun flavor. So I'm going to give that another 10 seconds under the broiler. We'll pull it out. And you guys want to grab 2 plates and 2 bowls there, Clem. You guys can have a little snack.
Somebody had a question about the salt.
Yes.
So, was it 3 tablespoons or 3 teaspoons?
I'm guessing it was about 3 teaspoons, but what I recommend for everybody on the salt is all the recipes I'm going to give you are going to say salt to taste. And that's because people vary on how much they like. But add a little bit at a time. So start with 1 teaspoon, taste it. Add a 2nd teaspoon, taste it. Add a 3rd teaspoon, taste it. And when you're doing that, please stop before you can taste salt. You don't want anything to taste salty. Hey, Vi, you want one too? Grab a third plate in the bowl. Looks like Violet just showed up. All right, so we're all done with this soup. I'm gonna move it to the tureen. Again, I like using my sink for that in case I spill anything. It's easy to clean up and nobody will get hurt. We're gonna do that. I'm gonna put a little water on the pot so that it's easier to clean later. All right, you want to put that in there, Vi?
I guess serving spoon.
And I almost left these in too long. All right, whew. I think we got those out just in the nick of time. I was starting to smell them. Your nose is your best friend in the kitchen. Use it and react to it. We got those out just in time. So we're just starting to get, it's just on this side of being burned, but the flavor and that's gonna be really awesome. If you preferred something a little less dark, you could have stopped it earlier. And Lou, you want to grab me a spatula?
Sure. Here.
Sorry, the other kind, like this. Sorry, like this kind of spatula. This spatula is from my grandma, the same one who had the wacky cake recipe, and she had this in her kitchen for a really long time. It's an awesome spatula. I remember thinking it was really funny looking when she used to use it, and then she gave it to me one time. My grandma lived to be 101, and she just passed away not that long ago. But before that, when she was still living in her house, she gave me this spatula to take home one day, and I love it. It's a really small spatula, but it's thin enough to get under things, and it's awesome. All right, so here we go. We have some toast and some tomato soup, and you guys want to sit down? Violet, do you want to grab the soup ladle?
Sure.
And these are sometimes a little easier to eat if we cut them in half. Let's cut a few of these. There's a nice little crunch while I'm cutting those. I'm really happy with that. Hear that little crunch, and you can see like the bread's not soggy. It's like a little toasted even on the bottom side. If we just broiled them and we didn't bake them, we wouldn't have gotten to that point. So. That was why we started with the bake and then moved to the broil. Oh, you don't have the ladle? It might be in this dishwasher. We have been having a lot of soup lately. I don't see it. Did it get put up here? No? You sure it's not over there, Vi? Alright, let me have a look.
It smells good.
Well, this is like the mystery of the missing soup ladle.
We could use this. This would be great.
Yeah, we really don't. Where did it go? Oh, there it is. I just didn't look right in place. Okay, so I just want to show you guys how I might serve this. This is typically a meal that we would have for lunchtime. Occasionally dinner, but maybe a light dinner, but usually this would be something we have for lunch. And when I was growing up, I loved it when we had grilled cheese and tomato soup. It was one of my dad's favorite things, so he loved making it. And with a little toasted open-faced sandwich, Violet, I'll make sure you don't have the mushroom one. There you go. Until you learn to like them, huh? And grab some spoons, you guys can take it. I'm going to take a still of yours. Super yummy. And we may even drizzle a little bit of olive oil on the top of that soup. And that's our Roman tomato soup with some open-faced sandwiches. So a quick meal to make at home. We all love it. I hope you guys do too. Send us in pictures, tag us on social media if you make something. I think it's great. It's great for us to see. I'm excited when I see somebody doing something, but I think it's also great for your friends to see. You guys can try new things and encourage other people too as well. We will be back tomorrow. Yeah, one more question. Oh.
Yeah, so they just clarified it. They said there's a Dutch oven for the soup instead of the sauce pot.
Yes, that's great. Anything that's going to be temperature safe is fine. For tomato soup, you may not want to use cast iron if you have another option. Cast iron can be a little vulnerable to acid, so this is a little bit on the acidic side. But if it's all you have, I'm sure it'll be fine, and there's ways to season it so it can stand up to that. We will talk about cast iron seasoning in a future episode. Another thing we're going to talk about is we're going to make, tomorrow, we're going to come back to some beans, we're going to do some black beans, and Violet is going to make some tortillas. It's one of her favorite things to do. We have Mexican food a lot. When we were talking to Michael Doctor last week, he was saying that's something he eats a lot at his house. And we do too. And Violet's become an awesome tortilla maker. So she's going to demonstrate how to make tortillas at home, which is a really fun thing to do. And it's inexpensive and delicious and super nutritious. We'll talk a little bit about nixtamalization. And next week, we're going to start getting into bread, which should be really exciting. The bread we just had today is a loaf of bread I made. We'll show you guys how to make, it's a whole wheat loaf. And we'll show you how to make this and other types of bread next week, which should be a lot of fun, including I've been working with a friend on a spontaneously fermented loaf, and if we can figure out how to make that a robust recipe, we'll share it with you all as well. It should be a really fun and exciting thing. Oh, one more question. Okay.
What do you normally serve with the soup?
What do we normally serve with the soup? Well, with this soup, the tomato soup, we would usually have like a grilled cheese, or we'd have something like this. At Clover, we didn't have a grilled cheese on the menu. When we brought this soup on the menu, I felt like we needed a grilled cheese. So we brought a toasted tomato cheese sandwich and a pita bread onto the menu specifically for the soup. So I think it goes really nicely with some crusty bread or a grilled cheese sandwich or an open-faced sandwich like this. All right, that's going to be it for today. Thank you, everybody, and we'll be back tomorrow.